Hello everyone, Kung here, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about building and designing your offensive strategy when you're theory crafting in Path of Exile. And so the purpose of this video is really to help provide those beginning theory crafters with the tools and ways of thinking that are going to help them be successful in designing a character and build in Path of Exile. And so this video is aimed at intermediate players. So if you're a first time player in Path of Exile, this is not your video. However, if you're a player who has some degree of familiarity with the game, maybe you've played and followed build guides and had successful characters and played through the content of the game, but you've decided that you want to start designing your own characters, this is your video. And so when it comes to dealing damage in Path of Exile, the skill gems essentially fall into two classes. There are spells and there are attacks. I've included a little bit larger set of skill gems in this category called spells, such as traps and totems, because they often have that spell tag on them. And so these are two big broad classes that I'm using to describe basically these two categories. And so there's some benefits and limitations depending upon when you're designing a build, if you want to build a spell-based build or if you wanted to build an attack-based build. And so one of the benefits of using spells is that they're accuracy independent. They have a 100% hit chance, assuming that the enemy is within the appropriate parameters. You don't have to worry about accuracy like you do when you have an attack-based build. Attacks, assuming you're not using resolute technique, are going to be based upon your accuracy rating and the enemy's evasion rating to determine whether or not that attack will actually hit the enemy. Another difference in spells versus attacks is that where your damage comes from in a spell-based build is based upon primarily the level of this gem that you're using. And this is different than an attack-based build, which is really based much more upon the weapon that you're using. And so essentially the primary difference here is that spells are going to have a lot less variation in how much damage they deal because they're based upon the level of the gem. So you're still able to scale them up and down, but because that gem level is such a strong determinant, they sort of have a little bit lower ceiling, but their floor is also higher. That is, you get a little less range of variation in how much damage they deal. And this is in contrast to attack-based builds, which scale much more off of the gear that you're using, especially the weapon. And so this means although if you have a really low damage weapon, you can do worse damage than you would be with a spell at that level. If you have a very strong weapon, it also means you could be dealing a lot more damage than you would be if you were using a spell-based build at this level. And so the first fundamental question you have to answer is, are you designing a build based around spells or based around attacks? So the second major question you have to answer is, are you designing a crit build or a non-crit build? And similar to spells and attacks, these both have some benefits and limitations. So one of the benefits of a non-crit build is that they're more consistent in the kind of damage that they put out. And this is the case until you're designing a crit build, which once you have a large amount of crit chance, then you're going to be able to provide that more consistent larger damage output. But until you reach that, crit builds tend to be very spiky. Non-crit builds also provide a greater degree of flexibility with the items that you're using because you're worried about one less modifier on your, or two less modifiers, crit chance and crit multiplier. However, this greater flexibility in the itemizations for non-crit builds is also a drawback, because once you get that really ideal gear in a crit build, you're able to scale your damage a lot higher. And so with these two ideas in mind, are we doing spells versus attacks, and are we going crit versus non-crit? There's some language that is frequently used in scaling your damage that is often convoluted, and I want to address this convoluted language here. And the reason they're different is because when Path of Exile computes the damage, it calculates it differently depending upon which language is used. So modifiers that use the word increased or reduced are all added together. They're all linear ways of scaling your damage. And so I have some examples of where you might see these. So for example, the faster projectile support gem indicates that it will do an increase of 20 to 29% projectile damage. But these also can come in other places as well, such as on the passive tree where you might have increases in the physical damage that's dealt, or maybe in jewels where you see increased cast speed or increased attack speed. And the key thing here is that when this word increased is used, what it means is that all the modifiers that increase your damage first are going to be added together when the damage is being calculated. The reason this is different is because when the phrasing more or less is used, rather than combining all of those modifiers together with addition, they're combined together with multiplication. And this, similar to the increased and reduced modifiers, shows up in a variety of places. One common place where it shows up is through the use of gems, such as the support gem melee physical damage. But this can actually show up sometimes on spells or other gems themselves, such as in Flame Surge, which will do 50% more damage to burning enemies. But it's not the only place where it shows up on support gems. It also sometimes shows up such as in passive tree keystone, such as the new elemental overload keystone on the tree, and it also shows up in ascendancies as well, such as the Marauder's Berserker. Again, the key thing I want to emphasize with this language is that when the phrasing increased and reduced is used, all of those modifiers are added together in the damage calculation, and all of the more or less modifiers are all multiplied together. And so to give a little bit of context for the example I'm going to use, I want to focus in on the base damage that Ice Nova does. And I pulled this information from the wiki. And so what I've highlighted here in this red box is the base damage that this spell does based upon the level of the gem. And so you might notice that when it's a level 10 gem, it's going to do between 100 low end and 157 top end damage. So this is important because the base damage is not a static fixed value. Rather, it has a range of values that it can take on. And the way that damage is calculated in Path of Exile is that each hit, and that's what I want to emphasize with this calculation, it's not your damage per second or your deeps, this is a per hit calculation. So per hit, it starts with that base damage and it scales it by the sum of all those increased and reduced modifiers. And then it takes and multiplies that by the product of all those more and less multipliers. And that's how you determine how much damage that spell Ice Nova is going to do on a per hit basis. So what is often referenced is how much damage per second, or deeps, DPS, is being used. And this is really oftentimes referred to as the average damage per second. And the way this is calculated is that base damage for Ice Nova had a low end, 100, that would be scaled by the sum of all those increased and reduced modifiers, and then the product of the more and the less, as well as that top end of 157. And you would average those values to determine the average damage per hit, and then what happens is that's scaled by the number of casts, or if you were using an attack-based build, whatever that average damage was for the weapon you were using, or that's been scaled. That's going to be then scaled by the number of times you're going to be casting or attacking per second, and that's what's oftentimes shows up on the tooltip damage that you're using. So I have a couple disclaimers here. This is technically not exactly it, because for attacks, you have to weight this against your accuracy, assuming your non-resolute technique, especially for crit-based builds. And for crit-based builds, you have to account for non-crit hits as well as those hits that do crit, and the crit multiplier that applies then. So it's not perfect here, but the essential idea is that there are two types of calculations. There's how much damage you're going to do each time your spell or attack hits, and there's going to be how much damage per second you're dealing, which is that average damage per hit that's scaled by the number of times you can do this in 1 second. And so what I really want to illustrate is in that calculation formula of how much damage you're dealing on a per hit basis, those more multipliers are really the thing that is exceptionally powerful. And so I have an example here with some calculations to help illustrate that. So imagine you're using that Ice Nova and you're supporting it with 2 support gems. Controlled Destruction, we'll say it's level 10, which does 34% more spell damage, and maybe you're using Elemental Focus as well, again level 10, and this will do 39% more damage. And so what this means is that because these are both more multipliers, they are going to be multiplied together first whenever we're calculating and scaling the base damage of that Ice Nova. This is different than if they were increased multipliers. If they were increased, the 34% and the 39% would be added together. And what's really powerful is because they're more multipliers and they're multiplied together, that result is an increase of 86.26% in the base damage that's being dealt. And so what this really means is that if you weren't using these support gems, but if you had 2 other support gems that you were using that used the increased language, you would have to have a total sum of a little over 86%. Well, the reason this is notable is if you add 34% and 39% together, you're going to come up with 73%. So the fact that these are multiplied together versus added together means that they're more efficient. So the TLDR here is that more multipliers are the most desirable method for scaling your damage because they do it in the most efficient manner possible. Mathematically, we're seeing exponential growth really carrying a lot of weight here in contrast to the linear growth that shows up with that increased and reduced language. And so these are not the only things that you want to think about when you're planning and designing your build, trying to stack as many of those more multipliers as possible, but you also want to think about, are you going to be doing a slower, heavier hit, or are you going to hit quicker but have a little bit smaller hits? And so you want to take this into account because at a certain point it can become inefficient to try and make your hit larger and larger and larger, and you might start getting more value out of increasing how quickly you can hit the enemy, either with your spell or your attack. And so it's also important then when you're considering this balancing of how frequently and heavy do I hit with if you can support the mana cost or not. Additionally, not every skill is going to scale the same way with attack speed. So for example, traps do not sort of have an attack speed or cast speed way of scaling them. The primary way that you're going to scale your trap damage is just through a really hard hit. Yes, there are other considerations here as well, such as how quickly you can throw your traps out, but you also have to take into account how quickly your traps recover and what your cooldown is for them. And so another example of this is Ice Crash. Ice Crash as part of this skill has a 25% less attack speed modifier with it. So what this means is that it makes any attack speed that you pick up not as efficient as it would be with other skills. For example, if you had 80% attack speed from all your passives and gear and gems, what it's really going to be like is if you only had 60% attack speed because of that 25% less reduction. It's also important to note that when you're trying to balance how hard do you hit and how quickly do you hit, that you typically want to be able to kill normal white mobs in a single hit, and you want to be able to kill blue magic packs in about 2 to 3 hits. And so if you find yourself killing white and blue packs in one hit, the way that you're going to be able to improve your effective clear is by hitting quicker, so you can move from one pack to the next in a quicker manner. Similarly, if you find yourself having to attack a white mob 2 or 3 times to kill them, and then blue packs 5 or 6 times, you know you want to start making your hits hit heavier, and you want to scale up the amount of damage you're doing on a per hit basis. Another consideration to take is how will flat damage be used, whether you're using spells or attacks. And so to do this, you want to look at the damage effectiveness that's listed on the skill gem. If it is not explicitly stated damage effectiveness is 30% or 90% or 50%, it's assumed to be 100%. And so the real fundamental question that you have to answer with all these considerations in mind is, how am I going to scale my damage? Do I want a little bit smaller fast hits? Do I want a slower, really heavy hit? Or as well as how am I going to deal with adding flat damage? And so what I want to close with is that when you're scaling up your damage and you're trying to make comparisons of, is this a suitable amount of damage for my build, is that you cannot compare your Tooltip DPS for different skills. So for example, a 10k tooltip on Ice Crash is not going to carry the same weight and show the same clear speed as a 10k tooltip for Ice Trap. And so to help make you more successful at being able to plan your offense, I'd encourage you to look back at builds that you've played and you've had success with, and you felt like that it was a strong build offensively, and try and identify what was it that that build was doing that made it feel so powerful, especially paying attention to the way that any more and less modifiers are being used. Hope you enjoyed this video and it's helpful for you for designing your offense in the build that you're theory crafting. I'm going to go ahead and post links to a write-up that I have below, as well as an abbreviated version of this video. Good luck with your theory crafting. Feel free to post any questions or comments that you have, and I will see you guys around. Thanks for watching.